I turned 70 and learned the truth about my children's father. What I said next changed everything. I never imagined that reaching the age of 70 would bring me the kind of truth that could shake my bones more violently than any hardship I had faced in my younger years. For decades, I lived with questions I learned to bury deep inside me, choosing survival over clarity, peace over confrontation, and motherhood over every other identity I ever carried. I raised 6 children with a heart full of love, but a mind full of unanswered doubts, trusting that someday the universe would reveal what it had kept hidden from me for so long. I didn't know how or when, and sometimes I believed the answers might never come at all. Time has a way of softening the urgency of old wounds, but it never completely erases them. As I sat on the porch on the morning of my 70th birthday, watching the sun paint the sky with gentle colors, something in me felt strangely unsettled. It was as if the last piece of a puzzle I had avoided my entire life was finally ready to fall into place. I didn't expect a knock on the door. I didn't expect an old face from my past to walk into my home. And I certainly didn't expect the truth about the father of my children to arrive in the form of a confession that had been locked away for decades. When I opened the door and saw him standing there, older, slower, carrying guilt in the slumped weight of his shoulders, the memories came rushing back with a force I was not prepared for. He looked at me with eyes that once held promises, but never commitment, eyes that once made me believe I mattered more than the world allowed me to. He had aged, perhaps more severely than I had, and for a moment we stood in silence, the kind of silence that carries history, regret, and unspoken apologies. He told me he had something to say, something he should have said long ago, something that had kept him awake more nights than he cared to admit. His voice trembled as he spoke, and each word he delivered felt like a stone dropping into the quiet lake of my memories. He told me that the truth I had sought, the truth I thought I would die without knowing, had been his burden, his shame, and his secret. He said he had watched our children grow from a distance, not because he wanted to stay away, but because circumstances, choices, and fear had built a wall he never learned how to climb over. He admitted that life had punished him in ways he could never describe, that the years had been unkind to a man who ran from responsibility but never escaped the weight of his actions. Listening to him stirred something inside me, not anger, not pain, but a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. The years had changed us both, but the truth still had the power to reach into places time could not heal. My children had grown into adults with their own lives, their own families, their own understanding of who their mother was. I had carried the role of both parents, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. And now the man who had given them life stood before me, asking for forgiveness that he never had the courage to seek before. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, steady, and far stronger than I felt. What I said to him changed the air in the room, changed the weight he carried, and changed the story of our family in ways none of us could have predicted. It wasn't a scream or an accusation. It wasn't a plea or a cry. It was the truth I had learned through a lifetime of raising children on my own, the truth that came from resilience, survival, and the quiet strength of motherhood. Here is a minimum 600-word expansion of your line. No bullet points, no ending sentence. She said this at 70 and every man went silent, the secret she hid for decades. She had lived 70 long years, most of them in shadows she never chose, carrying truths that weighed more than any burden her hands had ever held. Time had carved lines across her face, each one a silent chapter of a life spent balancing duty and sacrifice, love and fear, dreams and disappointment. And yet, even with all the years behind her, there were parts of her story no one had ever heard. She had always been the quiet one, the strong one, the woman who never complained, never exposed the storms inside her. But on the evening of her 70th birthday, something inside her shifted. It wasn't rebellion, and it wasn't desperation. It was simply time. Her children gathered around her, grown now, carrying their own exhaustion, their own questions about life. Her grandson sat near her feet, watching her with curiosity, sensing that this wasn't just another family gathering. Even the sons-in-law and the men of the family stood a little straighter than usual, feeling a strange heaviness in the room. She had called everyone together, not out of celebration but out of an unspoken urgency. She had written a few words on a folded piece of paper the night before, unsure if she would ever read them aloud. But now the moment had arrived. Undeniable, inevitable. She looked around the room, her eyes resting briefly on every face, and something in her expression made every conversation fade into silence. She took a deep breath, one that felt like she was inhaling all the years she had stayed quiet. Then she began to speak. Her voice wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was calm, steady, and terrifying in its honesty. She said that there was something she had never told anyone, not her children, not her closest friend, not even the man she had once loved. She said there were truths a woman hides because she is afraid of breaking the people she tries to hold together. She said she had lived with one particular secret for decades, believing that time would erase it or that life would eventually expose it for her. But neither happened. The men in the room, sons, grandsons, and the husbands of her daughters, grew very still. They knew she was a woman of discipline, a woman who never spoke without purpose. She said she had spent her entire life watching the world applaud men for their strength, their courage, their ability to decide what mattered. Yet she had learned early that a woman's strength often came from silence, from enduring, from carrying things she could never share. She didn't say this with bitterness. She said it with a clarity that cut through the room like lightning. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat straighter in her chair. She spoke of the first time she realized that her life would not be her own, that survival meant choosing silence over truth. She described moments of betrayal she had swallowed to keep her family intact, choices she made that no one ever questioned because they assumed she was simply doing what mothers, wives, and daughters do. She said she had lived through nights no one knew about, nights when the weight of her secret kept her awake until dawn. She admitted that the years had been heavier than she ever let on. As she revealed the truth she had hidden, one tied to the pain, loyalty, fear, and resilience that shaped her entire life, the men listened without interrupting. Some shifted uncomfortably, others lowered their eyes, and a few looked at her as though seeing her for the first time. Her words held a mirror to the expectations placed on women for generations. She spoke of the quiet sacrifices she made when no one was watching. She spoke of the strength required not to fight, but to continue. She spoke of the guilt she had carried alone because she believed that exposing it would destroy the people she loved. When she finished, she didn't cry, she didn't apologize. She simply sat in stillness, breathing through the weight that had lifted from her, a weight she had carried longer than some of the people in the room had been alive. Every man remained silent, not because they didn't know what to say, but because for the first time they understood how little they had ever truly seen her. A 70-year-old grandma reveals the truth about her children's father. No one expected this. For 70 years, she lived a life that looked simple to everyone around her. A small house on a quiet street, a garden she tended every morning, a kitchen where she cooked with the kind of love only grandmothers know. To the world she was gentle, wise, and endlessly patient. To her children she was the steady heartbeat that never faltered, the person who held the family together even when life strained every thread. But beneath the soft lines of her smile and the calm rhythm of her routine, she carried a truth so heavy and so deeply buried that no one, not her children, not her closest friends, not even the man it involved, ever suspected its existence. On her 70th birthday, surrounded by children and grandchildren, she felt something inside her shift. It wasn't fear, it wasn't regret. It was simply the weight of time pressing on her shoulders, urging her to speak the truth she had swallowed for decades. She looked around the living room, at the faces she had cared for, protected, and guided through life. They were laughing, unaware of the storm quietly forming behind her eyes. She realized that if she didn't speak now, she never would. And she knew that the truth she had hidden was no longer hers to carry alone. When she called everyone to sit down, the room fell into a natural silence, the kind that comes when people sense something important is about to happen. Her children exchanged quick glances, wondering what their mother could possibly have to say that required such gravity. She sat in her favorite armchair, the one by the window where she spent countless afternoons thinking about the life she built and the secrets she kept. Her hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from the weight of the moment that she knew would change everything. She began by speaking about her early years as a young woman, before she became a mother, before she learned what heartbreak truly meant. She described meeting a man who filled her world with promises, a man who spoke beautifully but lived carelessly. She told them how she fell in love with him, not knowing that the love she offered would become the most complicated choice of her life. Her children watched her with wide eyes, realizing they were about to hear something they had never imagined. She told them that the man they believed to be their father was not the man who had given them life. The truth was more tangled, more painful, and more deeply rooted in the fear and vulnerability of her younger self. She revealed that their real father was a man she once loved fiercely, a man who walked away just when she needed him most, leaving her with 6 children to raise alone. She explained how she protected them from the truth because she did not want them to grow up feeling unwanted or abandoned. She created a story to shield them from the reality of their father's absence, a story she carried like armor for years. The room changed. The air thickened with shock, confusion, disbelief. Her daughters sat frozen, her sons stared at the floor, and her grandchildren looked at one another, unsure of how to process what they had just heard. No one expected this from the woman who had always been the silent strength of the family. Yet here she was, revealing the deepest, most painful truth of her life with the calmness of someone who had finally found the courage to speak. She continued explaining how she had tried to reach out to him once, years after he left, only to discover he had started a new life with another woman in another city. She never told anyone, choosing instead to protect her children from the disappointment of knowing they had been replaced. She had raised them with the belief that love was unconditional, even when the one who created them had chosen not to stay. Her voice did not shake as she spoke. Her heart did not crumble. She was simply releasing decades of silence, finally giving her children the truth she hoped they were strong enough to hear. She had lived long enough to learn that silence can become a prison, and truth, no matter how old, can still strike like lightning. At 70 years old, she was not a woman who sought attention, nor someone who believed her life story held any kind of dramatic power. She had spent decades behind the quiet routines of motherhood and grandmotherhood, stitching together a life that appeared ordinary to anyone who looked from the outside. People saw kindness in her eyes, strength in her hands, and calm in the way she moved through the world. What they never saw was the story she kept buried deep inside, a story that had shaped her in ways she never dared to confess. But everything changed on the afternoon when she finally spoke the words she had held back for so long. He came to see her unexpectedly, a man from her past, a man she once loved, once trusted, once feared losing, and eventually learned to live without. Time had chiseled his features just as it had hers, but something about him, maybe the heaviness in his walk or the hesitation in his eyes, made her realize that the moment she had avoided for most of her life had finally arrived. He stood at her door with the awkwardness of someone who carried a truth he no longer knew how to contain. She invited him in, not out of eagerness, but out of a calm acceptance that what needed to be spoken could no longer stay buried. He sat across from her, his hands shaking slightly, the silence stretching between them like a thin, fragile thread. She watched him struggle to find his words, struggle to explain why he had shown up after all these years. She could sense the regret weighing on him, the kind that grows heavier with every year left unspoken. He began to talk about the past, about the choices he made, about the things he wished he had done differently. His voice cracked, his eyes lowered, and his shoulders slumped as though he carried the ghosts of decades on his back. But she didn't interrupt. She didn't speak. Not yet. She simply listened, allowing him to unburden himself in a way he never had the courage to do when they were young. When he finally paused, waiting for her response, it wasn't anger that filled the room. It wasn't bitterness or resentment. What filled the room was the weight of everything she had learned in the years he had been absent. She had raised children alone. She had endured rumors, loneliness, exhaustion, and the constant struggle of being both mother and father. She had woven her life from threads of survival, determination, and quiet resilience. And now, as she looked at him, she realized he still had no idea what those years had truly cost her. She leaned back in her chair and took a slow breath. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft but unshakably steady, the kind of voice that only comes from a lifetime of holding back. She told him the truth he never knew, the truth she had kept to protect her children, to protect herself, and perhaps even to protect him. She told him about the night she discovered he had been living another life, promising other women the same dreams he whispered to her. She told him about the moment she realized she could no longer wait for a man who chose uncertainty over responsibility. She revealed how she had learned the truth about her children's father, how betrayal had forced her to harden her heart and carry everything alone. As her words poured out, he froze. His breath stalled in his chest. His eyes widened, and his hands curled into fists, not in anger at her, but in the crushing realization of what he had stolen from her, without ever understanding the damage he caused. Every sentence she spoke cracked open a door he had locked in his mind for years. He had come expecting forgiveness, maybe even gratitude for returning. Instead, he found himself face to face with the truth he had hidden from himself for most of his life. She didn't shout, she didn't cry. She simply revealed the story she had guarded like a fragile secret, a story that transformed the air around them. It wasn't revenge she offered him, but clarity, the kind of clarity that leaves a man standing in the ruins of his own choices. And for the first time since their youth, he saw her not as the girl he once pursued, but as the woman who had survived without him, the woman who had found strength in the silence he left behind. Here is your minimum 600-word expansion with an ending sentence written in bullet point form exactly as requested. At 70, she unlocked the secret of her children's father, a confession that shook everyone. She had spent her entire lifetime carrying a secret so heavy it had settled into her bones, shaping the way she walked through the world, the decisions she made, and the mother she became. At 70 years old, she finally felt the weight shifting, not because it had grown lighter, but because she had grown tired. Tired of silence, tired of remembering alone, tired of pretending that some wounds were ever truly forgotten. Her 6 children and their families believed they knew everything about her life, everything about their past, everything about the father they had mourned or misunderstood. But they knew only the story she had chosen to give them, the one she crafted carefully to protect them from a truth she feared would break them. On the morning of her 70th birthday, something inside her changed. She woke before sunrise, sat at the edge of her bed, and felt an unusual stillness in her heart. It was not fear, it was not regret, it was clarity, the kind that arrives only when a person has lived long enough to realize that truth has its own timing and silence has its limits. She decided it was time to unlock what she had sealed away decades ago. The family gathered at her home later that day. Her children, now adults with children of their own, filled the house with laughter and warm chatter, unaware of the storm quietly forming behind their mother's eyes. She watched them, memorizing their faces, seeing traces of the man who had given them life even though they did not know it. That secret lived in their smiles, their tempers, the curve of their brows. She had always seen it. She had learned to live with it. But they remained completely unaware. After the meal, she asked everyone to sit. The tone of her voice alone silenced the room. They had seen her strong, kind, tired, joyful, but never this serious. She folded her hands in her lap, took in a slow breath, and began speaking in a voice that carried the echo of all the years she had lived in silence. She told them about the love she once had, the kind that sweeps into a young woman's life like a storm, promising more than it ever delivers. She described a man who was charming, passionate, and unforgettable, a man who gave her hope and fear in equal measure. She admitted he was the father of all her children, every single one of them. The man they had grown up believing was their father was not the man who had given them life. He was the man who married her, stayed, worked, and raised them as his own, the man who protected them from the truth as loyally as she did. The room erupted in confusion. Her children stared at her, stunned, speechless, disoriented. She continued speaking softly, explaining that the real father had never truly left her heart, but he had left her life. He had chosen another path, another home, another woman. She had carried her heartbreak in silence. She had chosen not to destroy her children's sense of belonging. She had built a story strong enough to shelter them from the pain of abandonment. But now, at 70, she felt they were grown enough, wise enough, and strong enough to hear the truth she had swallowed for decades. She told them she had hidden this not to deceive them, but to protect them. She said the truth was not meant to hurt them. It was meant to free her. Her children sat in stunned disbelief, each processing the revelation in their own way. Some felt betrayed, some felt relief, some felt curiosity. But all of them felt the magnitude of what she had carried alone. For decades, she had lived between two realities, the life she built and the truth she buried. She looked at each of them, one by one, and waited. Not for forgiveness, not for approval, only for understanding. She had finally released the secret she believed she would take to her grave. She had spoken the truth with the same love she had raised them with. And as she finished, she whispered the final truth she had held inside her heart all those years, knowing it was finally time to let herself breathe again.